The transport ship shook as enemy fire hit its shields again, and Jake Miller gripped his rifle tighter while looking out at the burning planet below them. The world of Sylvana had been beautiful once, with silver trees and crystal cities, but now smoke rose from every direction, and the elegant spires lay broken like scattered glass. Captain Lisa Hayes stood at the front of the cargo bay, speaking to her soldiers, and her voice was calm, even though everyone knew this mission was almost impossible. The Sylvani people looked like elves from old Earth stories with pointed ears, and silver hair that seemed to glow in moonlight, but they were real, and they were dying. The Korthak Empire had come to their world 3 months ago demanding surrender, and when the peaceful Sylvani refused, the aliens began killing everyone they could find. The Sylvani had no weapons and no armies because they had never needed them. Before and now they were helpless against the brutal invaders. Jake was 24 years old and had been a Marine for 6 years, but he had never seen anything as terrible as what the Korthaks were doing to innocent people. The distress signal from Sylvana had reached Earth 2 weeks ago, and the Terran Defense Corps had sent every ship they could spare, but they all knew they were probably too late to save many lives. The Korthaks were known across the galaxy for leaving no survivors when they conquered a world. Commander Ryan Clark had briefed them before the drop, and his orders were simple. Get in fast, find any surviving Sylvani civilians, and get them to the evacuation ships before the Korthaks could stop them. Intelligence reports said there might be hidden bunkers where people were hiding, but the enemy was searching for them with scan drones and heat sensors. Every minute counted because once the Korthaks found a hiding place, they would bomb it from orbit. The ship lurched again, and Jake saw Lisa checking her weapon one more time before giving the signal to prepare for landing. Through the small window, he could see other human ships dropping through the atmosphere while enemy fighters chased them and fired plasma bolts that lit up the sky like deadly fireworks. Some of the human ships were already burning as they fell, but their pilots kept flying toward the surface because lives depended on reaching the ground. When the transport hit the ground, Jake felt his stomach drop, but he was running before the ramp finished opening. The air outside smelled like smoke and burning metal, and he could hear explosions in the distance where other teams were fighting Korthak ground forces. Lisa pointed toward a cluster of broken buildings about half a mile away and shouted over the noise that sensors had detected possible life signs in an underground area beneath the ruins. Jake ran with his squad across ground that was covered with silver dust from the destroyed crystal buildings, and he tried not to look at the bodies they passed along the way. The Sylvani had been so beautiful and peaceful, and seeing them killed like this made anger burn in his chest like a fire that would not go out. He had joined the Marines to protect people who could not protect themselves, and this was exactly why humans needed to be strong enough to fight monsters like the Korthaks. When they reached the ruined buildings, Lisa used a scanner to search for the entrance to whatever was hidden below ground. The readings showed a large space about 30 feet down, with several heat signatures that might be living beings, but the entrance was buried under tons of rubble from a collapsed tower. Jake and 2 other Marines started moving chunks of crystal and metal while Lisa watched for enemy patrols, and the sounds of battle grew closer from every direction. It took them 20 minutes to clear enough debris to find a doorway that led to stairs going down into darkness. Jake went first with his rifle ready and a light attached to his helmet showing the way through a tunnel that had been carved from solid rock. The walls were smooth and covered with Sylvani writing that looked like flowing water frozen in stone, and even in this terrible situation, Jake could see how artistic and beautiful their culture had been. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, where Jake saw them hiding in the shadows. There were about 15 Sylvani civilians, including elderly people and children, all pressed together against the far wall with fear in their large violet eyes. They looked like they had been without food or water for days, and some of them were injured, but they were alive, and that was what mattered most. Jake called softly to them in the few words of Sylvani language he had learned during the flight to their world, and he tried to keep his voice gentle so they would know he was there to help them. An elderly male stepped forward and spoke in accented English, saying they had been hiding for 5 days while listening to the sounds of their world being destroyed above them. He said most of their people were dead and they had given up hope, until they heard human voices. That was when Jake saw her in the corner of the chamber. She was small even for a Silvani and looked to be about 16 years old, with silver hair that caught the light from his helmet and made it seem like she was surrounded by starlight. She was hurt with blood on her arm, and her violet eyes were wide with shock. But she was watching him with an expression he had never seen before, like she was seeing hope for the first time in days. Lisa appeared behind Jake and told him they had maybe 10 minutes before Korthak forces found this location, because enemy scanners were getting closer and their transport pilot was reporting heavy fighting near the landing zone. They needed to move all the survivors to the surface immediately, but the injured girl looked too weak to walk, and Jake knew the climb would be difficult even for healthy people. Without thinking about it, Jake moved toward the girl and knelt down beside her while speaking softly in English and hoping his tone would tell her what his words could not. She looked into his eyes and seemed to understand that he wanted to help her, and when he reached out his hand, she took it with fingers that felt as light as bird bones. Jake carefully lifted her in his arms and felt how small and fragile she was, like she might break if he was not gentle enough. The girl said something in Silvani that he did not understand, but her voice was like music, even though she was frightened and hurt. Jake carried her toward the tunnel entrance, while Lisa helped the other survivors move as quickly as they could through the underground passage and up the stairs toward the surface, where death was waiting for anyone who moved too slowly. When they reached the outside world, Jake could see that the situation had gotten much worse in the short time they had been underground, because Korthak dropships were landing nearby and enemy soldiers were spreading out to search the area. The human transport was still there, but its engines were already running, and the pilot was shouting over the radio that they had less than 5 minutes before the ship would have to leave or be destroyed by incoming enemy fire. Jake ran toward the transport while carrying the Silvani girl, and he could feel her holding onto his uniform with both hands, like she was afraid he might let her go. Around them, the other Marines were helping elderly Silvani move faster than their tired legs wanted to carry them, while plasma bolts from enemy weapons started hitting the ground nearby and sending up clouds of silver dust that made it hard to see where they were going. The girl in his arms spoke again in her musical language, and this time Jake thought he heard his name mixed in with the Silvani words, like she was trying to tell him something important. He looked down at her face and saw that her violet eyes were fixed on his, while her lips moved in what might have been a promise or a prayer in words he could not understand, but somehow felt in his heart. They reached the transport just as enemy fire started hitting the ship itself, and Jake ran up the ramp while still carrying the girl who had become lighter in his arms, like she was made of moonlight instead of flesh and bone. Lisa was the last one aboard, and she slammed the emergency close button while shouting for the pilot to get them away from the surface before the Korthaks could destroy them all. As the ship lifted off, Jake found a place to sit while still holding the Silvani girl, and she looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness in the universe, but also something else that might have been gratitude or hope. She whispered something in Silvani that sounded like a name, but before he could ask what she meant, the medics took her away to treat her injuries, and Jake never saw her again. 3 days after the rescue mission, Jake Miller stood in the medical bay of the human space station Harmony, watching through a window as doctors worked to save the Silvani refugees they had pulled from their dying world. The girl he had carried to safety was in a bed connected to machines that monitored her heartbeat and breathing, while Dr. Amy Foster worked to heal the injuries she had suffered during the attack on her people. Jake wanted to go inside and check on her, but the doctor said she needed rest, and that human presence might frighten her after everything she had been through. Dr. Foster came out of the medical bay and told Jake that the girl was going to be fine physically, but that she had lost her entire family when the Korthaks destroyed her city. The doctor explained that Silvani people formed very strong emotional bonds with their relatives and that losing everyone she loved at once had left the girl in a state of shock that might take months or years to heal. Jake asked what would happen to her and the other survivors, and Dr. Foster said they were being taken to a refugee camp where human volunteers would help them start new lives. Jake never learned the girl's name because before he could visit her, again his unit received new orders and had to leave Harmony Station to respond to another emergency across the galaxy. As his transport ship pulled away from the station, Jake looked back through a window and wondered if the Silvani girl would remember the human soldier who had carried her to safety, or if she would forget him like a half-remembered dream from a time of terrible fear and pain. The girl, whose name was Zara, woke up in the human medical facility, and for a moment she did not remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the memories came flooding back like a dark tide, and she remembered the screaming and the explosions and the sight of her parents falling under Korthak weapons while she ran toward the hidden bunker beneath their city. She remembered hiding in the darkness for days while listening to the sounds of her world dying above her and thinking that she would never see sunlight again. But most of all, she remembered the human soldier who had found her in that dark place and carried her to safety. His face had been kind, even though it was covered with dust and sweat from battle, and his eyes had been gentle when he looked at her like she was something precious, instead of just another refugee to be saved. She had tried to tell him her name, and to thank him for saving her life, but the words had gotten lost between her language and his, and now she might never see him again. Dr. Foster visited Zara every day, and slowly helped her learn to speak English, while also teaching her about human culture and the refugee camp where she would be living until the Silvani people could find a new home world. The doctor was patient and kind like the soldier had been, and Zara began to understand that not all beings in the galaxy were as cruel as the Korthaks, who had destroyed everything she had ever known and loved. At the refugee camp, Zara met Elder Thane, who had been a teacher on Silvana before the invasion, and who now served as a leader for the surviving Silvani people. He became like a grandfather to her and helped her deal with the grief of losing her family, while also encouraging her to learn everything she could about the humans who had risked their lives to save people they had never met before. Elder Thane said that Zara had been given a gift by surviving when so many others had died, and that she should use that gift to help build bridges between their people and the brave humans who had become their protectors. Zara threw herself into learning, with an intensity that surprised everyone around her. She studied human languages and science and history, while also working to preserve what remained of Silvani culture so that future generations would remember their beautiful home world and the peaceful way of life that had been lost. She became fluent in 5 human languages and learned to use their computers and technology better than most humans could, and she never forgot that all of this had started with one soldier who had cared enough to carry her to safety. Jake Miller continued his military service and was promoted to sergeant after showing exceptional courage during a mission to protect a mining colony from space pirates. He led his squad through dangerous situations with the same careful concern for others that had made him risk his life to save Silvani civilians, and his fellow soldiers began to look up to him as someone they could trust with their lives. But in quiet moments, Jake often found himself thinking about the silver-haired girl with violet eyes who had whispered something in her musical language that he had never been able to understand. Lieutenant Kate Morgan joined Jake's unit 2 years after the Silvana mission and quickly became his closest friend among the Marines. She was smart and tough and shared Jake's belief that humans had a responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves, even when doing so meant facing overwhelming odds. Kate noticed that Jake sometimes seemed distant during their downtime, and when she asked him about it, he told her about the Silvani girl he had rescued and how he wondered what had happened to her after the medical team took her away. Kate suggested that Jake could try to find out what happened to the Silvani refugees through official channels, but Jake said he did not want to interfere in the girl's new life because she had probably forgotten about him anyway and was better off without reminders of the terrible day when her world had been destroyed. Kate thought Jake was wrong about being forgotten, but she did not push the subject because she could see that thinking about the girl made him both sad and somehow hopeful at the same time. Zara grew from a frightened teenager into a confident, young woman who impressed everyone she met with her intelligence and determination to help her people adapt to life among humans. She learned to work with human technology so well that she began developing new ways to improve communication between species, and her innovations caught the attention of scientists and diplomats throughout human space. She was invited to speak at conferences and to work on projects that brought different alien species together in peaceful cooperation. But no matter how successful Zara became or how many important people wanted to work with her, she never stopped thinking about the human soldier who had saved her life. She had learned enough about human military structure to understand that soldiers were often transferred from place to place, and that finding one specific person in all of human space would be like looking for a single star in a galaxy full of light. Still, she quietly gathered information whenever she could, and slowly began to piece together clues about the unit that had rescued her, and the brave humans who had risked everything to save people they did not even know. Dr. Foster stayed in touch with Zara over the years and was amazed to see how the frightened girl had grown into a brilliant young scientist and diplomat. When Zara turned 21, Dr. Foster gave her access to the medical records from her rescue and recovery, which included the names of the soldiers who had participated in the mission to save Silvani civilians. Zara found Jake Miller's name on the list and felt her heart race as she realized she finally had a way to begin looking for the man who had changed her life forever. Elder Thane watched Zara's search for her rescuer with mixed feelings because he could see how important finding Jake had become to her, but he also worried that she was building up expectations that might never be fulfilled. He reminded her that 7 years had passed since the rescue, and that Jake might have been killed in action or might have left military service and disappeared into civilian life where he would be impossible to track down. But Zara said she had to try because Jake Miller had given her a second chance at life, and she wanted him to know what she had done with that gift. Jake earned several medals for valor during his years of service and was eventually promoted to staff sergeant, but he turned down offers to become an officer because he preferred working directly with soldiers rather than sitting behind a desk making plans for other people to carry out. His superiors respected his choice and gave him command of an elite squad that specialized in rescue operations and humanitarian missions because they knew Jake had a special talent for saving lives in impossible situations. During a mission to evacuate civilians from a planet being torn apart by civil war, Jake's squad saved more than 300 people, including many children who reminded him of the Silvani girl he had rescued years before. After the mission, Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Price called Jake into her office and told him that his actions had been noted at the highest levels of command and that he was being considered for transfer to a special operations unit that handled the most dangerous rescue missions in human space. Jake accepted the transfer because he knew that every life he saved helped to balance the scales against all the death and suffering he had witnessed during his military career. He thought about the Silvani girl sometimes and wondered if she had found happiness in her new life among humans, and if she ever remembered the soldier who had carried her away from the darkness beneath her burning world. He hoped she had forgotten the worst parts of that day, and remembered only that someone had cared enough to risk everything to save her. The new Special Operations Unit sent Jake to places where regular military forces could not go, and he participated in missions that saved thousands of lives over the next 3 years. New Terra Station hung in space like a glittering jewel against the darkness between stars, and Zara pressed her face to the transport window as her ship approached the massive structure that had become the center of cooperation between humans and dozens of alien species. The station was beautiful in a way that reminded her of the crystal cities on Silvana before the Korthax had destroyed them, But this beauty was different, because it had been built by many different peoples working together instead of just one species creating art for themselves. Admiral Helen Ross had invited Zara to join a research project that would study ways to improve communication between species that had never met before, and Zara had accepted immediately because the work sounded important and because she had learned that New Terra Station was located near several patrol routes used by human military ships. She did not tell Admiral Ross that her real reason for coming to the station was to continue her search for Jake Miller, but she hoped that being closer to active military operations would give her better opportunities to find information about his current assignment. Kai had insisted on coming with Zara, even though his research specialty was different from hers, because he said she needed someone to watch out for her while she was distracted by her secret mission to find the human soldier who had saved her life. Kai was Zara's age and had also survived the destruction of Sylvana, but he had been rescued by a different human unit and did not understand why Zara was so focused on finding one specific person when there were thousands of humans who had participated in saving their people. Zara tried to explain to Kai that Jake Miller was not just any soldier to her, but the explanation always came out sounding inadequate, because human words could not express the way she felt about the man who had carried her from darkness into light when she thought she was going to die alone and forgotten. Kai listened patiently to her attempts to describe her feelings, but Zara could see in his eyes that he thought she was building up a fantasy about someone who had probably forgotten her completely and moved on with his life. The research facilities on New Terra Station were more advanced than anything Zara had worked with before, and she threw herself into the communication project with her usual intensity while also spending her free time accessing databases and personnel records that might contain information about Jake's whereabouts. Admiral Ross seemed pleased with Zara's work and began involving her in high-level meetings where she met military officers and diplomats who might have knowledge about special operations units and classified missions. Zara learned that Jake had been transferred to an elite rescue unit called Shadow Squadron that operated in the most dangerous parts of the galaxy, but she also discovered that information about the squadron's current missions was restricted to people with security clearances, far above her level. She felt frustrated because she was so close to finding Jake, but still could not reach him, and she began to wonder if the security restrictions were meant to protect soldiers like him from being contacted by people from their past who might distract them from their duties. Dr. Amy Foster arrived at New Terra Station 3 weeks after Zara and immediately recognized the young woman who had been a frightened girl in her medical bay 7 years before. Dr. Foster was amazed to see how Zara had grown and developed into a confident scientist and diplomat, but she also noticed that Zara seemed to be carrying some kind of burden that made her restless and distant even when she was surrounded by colleagues and friends. When Dr. Foster approached Zara after a research meeting and asked how she was adjusting to life on the station, Zara felt a mixture of joy and nervousness because this was the first person she had met since beginning her search who had actually known Jake Miller during the rescue mission. Dr. Foster invited Zara to have dinner together, and during their meal, Zara carefully brought up the subject of the soldiers who had saved her and asked if Dr. Foster knew what had happened to any of them over the years. Dr. Foster realized immediately that Zara was asking about Jake specifically, and she told Zara that she had kept track of some of the soldiers from that mission because she was interested in how traumatic rescue situations affected both the people being saved and the people doing the saving. She said that Jake Miller had continued his military career and had become known throughout the service for his exceptional courage and dedication to protecting civilian populations during conflicts and disasters. Zara felt her heart racing as Dr. Foster described Jake's career and confirmed that he was still alive and still serving, but she tried to keep her voice calm when she asked if Dr. Foster knew where Jake was currently stationed. Dr. Foster said she did not have current information about his assignment, but she offered to use her medical credentials to make inquiries through official channels because she said she had always wondered what happened to the brave young sergeant who had risked his life to save Sylvani refugees. While Zara waited for Dr. Foster to gather information about Jake's location, she continued her research work and began attending social events on the station where she might meet people with connections to military intelligence or special operations. At a memorial service for soldiers who had died protecting alien worlds, Zara met several officers who spoke about the importance of rescue missions and the soldiers who specialized in saving lives under impossible conditions, but none of them could give her specific information about Shadow Squadron or its current operations. Jake Miller was indeed serving with Shadow Squadron aboard a patrol ship called Liberty that was currently stationed 3 days' travel from New Terra Station, but he had no idea that the girl he had rescued on Sylvana was looking for him, or that she had grown into a brilliant scientist who was working just a few light years away from his position. Jake's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Beth Adams, had assigned his team to investigate reports of slave trading in a remote star system, and Jake was focused on planning a mission that might save hundreds of people from lives of captivity and abuse. Sergeant Ben Torres was Jake's second-in-command and had served with him for 2 years, during which time he had learned that Jake was the kind of leader who would always put the safety of innocent people ahead of his own survival. Ben had noticed that Jake sometimes seemed thoughtful and distant when they were between missions, and when Ben asked about it, Jake mentioned the Sylvani refugees he had helped rescue early in his career and how he sometimes wondered whether saving a few people really made any difference in a galaxy full of suffering and injustice. Ben told Jake that every life saved was important and that the people they rescued went on to live full lives and maybe save others in turn, so that one rescue mission could have effects that spread outward like ripples in a pond for years or even decades after the original event. Jake appreciated Ben's optimism, but he said he wished he could know for certain that the people he had saved had found happiness and purpose instead of just surviving in refugee camps or struggling to adapt to alien cultures that did not understand them. Dr. Foster's inquiries about Jake's location eventually reached someone who knew about Shadow Squadron's operations, and she learned that the Liberty was scheduled to return to New Terra Station for routine maintenance and crew rotation within the next month. Dr. Foster told Zara this news during another dinner meeting and watched as the young woman's face lit up with an expression of hope and excitement that made her look like the 16-year-old girl she had been when Jake Miller carried her to safety 7 years before. Zara asked Dr. Foster not to contact Jake directly because she wanted their reunion to happen naturally, and she was afraid that advance warning might make the meeting awkward or forced. Dr. Foster agreed to keep Zara's presence on the station secret, but she also warned Zara that Jake might not recognize her immediately because she had changed so much since their brief encounter during the rescue mission, and because he had probably met thousands of people during his years of military service. Zara said she understood the risks, but that she had to try to reconnect with Jake because he had saved more than just her life on Sylvana, and she wanted him to know how his act of courage had inspired everything she had accomplished since that day. She also admitted to Dr. Foster that she had carried feelings for Jake in her heart for 7 years, and that seeing him again would either allow her to finally express her gratitude properly or help her understand that the connection she felt was just a creation of her own imagination based on trauma and wishful thinking. Kai noticed that Zara had become even more distracted and restless after her conversation with Dr. Foster, and he confronted her about whether she was really committed to their research project or just using it as an excuse to chase after a memory from her past. Zara told Kai the truth about Jake's upcoming arrival at the station, and Kai said he was worried that she was setting herself up for disappointment because humans often did not form the same kind of deep emotional bonds that Sylvani people experienced, and Jake might see her as just another refugee he had helped during a routine mission. Zara knew that Kai might be right, but she also knew that she would never be able to move forward with her life until she had seen Jake again and either renewed their connection or spent. Jake Miller winced as the medical transport carried him from the Liberty's docking bay to New Terra Station's medical facility, and he tried not to think about how the mission to stop the slave traders had gone wrong when their information turned out to be incomplete. and they walked into a trap that left 3 of his team members injured, and Jake himself with a dislocated shoulder and burns on his left arm from a plasma weapon that had nearly killed him. Dr. Paul Green was waiting in the medical bay when Jake arrived and immediately began examining his injuries while asking questions about the mission and how long Jake had been ignoring the pain before finally agreeing to medical treatment. Jake said he had wanted to make sure his injured team members were stable before worrying about his own problems, and Dr. Green shook his head while muttering that special operations soldiers were the worst patients because they always tried to tough out injuries that would have civilian people screaming for help. Zara was organizing medical supplies in a storage room when she heard Dr. Green talking to a patient about plasma burns, and she felt her heart skip when she recognized something familiar in the voice that answered him. She moved closer to the treatment area and saw through a window the back of a man sitting on an examination table while Dr. Green worked on his shoulder, and even though 7 years had passed and he was older and more muscular than she remembered, Zara knew immediately that she was looking at Jake Miller. She stood frozen outside the treatment room, watching Jake and trying to decide what to do, because this was not how she had imagined their reunion happening, and she felt completely unprepared for the flood of emotions that seeing him again had released in her chest. Jake looked tired, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there when he was 24, but he still had the same gentle expression that had made her feel safe when he carried her away from the darkness beneath Sylvana. Dr. Green finished treating Jake's shoulder and told him that he needed to stay in the medical bay for observation overnight because plasma burns could sometimes cause delayed reactions that were dangerous if not monitored properly. Jake tried to argue that he was fine and needed to check on his injured team members, but Dr. Green said the other soldiers were being treated by specialists and that Jake's job now was to rest and let his body heal from the trauma it had experienced during the failed mission. Zara took a deep breath and knocked on the treatment room door before entering with a medical tablet in her hands and trying to look like she was just doing her job as a medical assistant. Even though her heart was beating so fast, she was afraid Jake might hear it. She said she was there to update his patient records, and Jake looked up at her with polite interest, while Dr. Green explained that Zara was a scientist who was helping with medical support during the busy period when multiple ships were docked at the station. Jake studied Zara's face as she asked him questions about his medical history and pain levels, and something about her seemed familiar, but he could not place where he might have seen her before, because her silver hair and violet eyes were unlike any human features he knew, and yet there was something in her expression that reminded him of someone important. Zara kept her voice professional while she filled out his medical forms, but inside she was struggling with disappointment because it was clear that Jake did not recognize her at all. Dr. Green left to check on other patients, and Jake found himself alone with the beautiful alien woman who had been asking him questions about his injuries. Zara sat down in a chair beside his bed and told him that she was actually a Sylvani and that she was working on communication research at the station while also helping with medical duties when ships brought in wounded personnel from dangerous missions like the one Jake had just completed. Something in the way Zara said Sylvani made Jake sit up straighter and look at her more carefully, because he had not heard that word spoken in years, and it brought back memories of burning cities and silver trees and a frightened girl with violet eyes who had whispered something in a musical language while he carried her to safety. Zara saw recognition beginning to dawn in Jake's face, and she felt her breath catch as she realized that he was starting to remember their first meeting 7 years before. Zara spoke a few words in Sylvani and watched as Jake's eyes widened with shock and amazement because the words she had chosen were the same ones she had whispered to him during the rescue mission when she was trying to tell him her name and thank him for saving her life. Jake stared at her in disbelief and said her name tentatively, like he was afraid he might be imagining the whole situation, and Zara felt tears starting in her eyes as she nodded and confirmed that she was the girl he had rescued from the bunker beneath her burning world. Jake could not believe that the confident and beautiful young woman sitting beside his bed was the same frightened teenager he had carried through enemy fire 7 years ago, because Zara had grown and changed so much that she seemed like a completely different person, except for her eyes, which still held the same mixture of intelligence and kindness that had made him want to protect her, even when it meant risking his own life. He asked how she had found him, and Zara explained that she had been searching for him for years because she wanted to thank him properly for what he had done and to show him what she had accomplished with the second chance at life he had given her. Zara told Jake about her years in the refugee camps and how she had learned human languages and science while also working to preserve Silvani culture and help other survivors adapt to life among humans. She described her education and her research work, and her role as a diplomat who helped different species understand each other, and Jake listened with growing amazement as he realized that the small act of carrying one girl to safety had somehow led to all of these achievements and contributions to galactic civilization. Jake said he had often wondered what happened to the Silvani refugees after the rescue mission, but that he had never imagined that any of them would become as successful and important as Zara had become. He told her about his own career and the missions he had completed since Silvana, and how he had always remembered the girl with violet eyes who had whispered something he could not understand, but that had somehow felt like a promise or a blessing that had stayed with him through years of dangerous assignments. Zara explained that what she had whispered to him in Silvani was a traditional phrase that meant, "May your kindness return to you tenfold," and that she had been trying to tell him that his act of courage would be rewarded by the universe in ways he could not imagine. Jake said he had never thought of himself as particularly courageous because saving people in danger was just what soldiers were supposed to do, but Zara shook her head and told him that choosing to risk his own life for strangers showed a kind of bravery that went beyond military duty. Dr. Green returned to check on Jake's condition and was surprised to find his patient looking more alert and energetic than he had when he first arrived at the medical bay. Jake introduced Dr. Green to Zara and explained that she was the Silvani girl he had rescued during one of his early missions, and Dr. Green said it was remarkable that they had found each other again after so many years and so many light years of separation between their different assignments and duties. Zara asked if she could stay with Jake while he recovered, and Dr. Green said that having a friend nearby might actually help with his healing, because isolation could slow recovery from trauma, while positive social contact often speeded the process. Jake said he would like Zara to stay because he had so many questions about her life and her work, and he wanted to understand how the frightened refugee had become the accomplished scientist and diplomat sitting beside his bed. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening while Jake rested, and Zara filled in the details of her story that she had not been able to explain during their first conversation. Jake learned that Zara had been accepted to study at the most prestigious universities in human space, and that her research had led to breakthroughs in interspecies communication that were being used to prevent conflicts and build alliances between peoples who had never been able to understand each other before. Zara asked Jake about his military service and the missions that had earned him medals for valor, and he told her about rescuing miners from collapsed tunnels and evacuating civilians from war zones and stopping pirates who preyed on defenseless cargo ships. As he described his work, Zara realized that Jake had spent the 7 years since their first meeting continuing to save people just like he had saved her, and that his commitment to protecting others had never wavered, despite the dangers and hardships he had faced. Lieutenant Sam Wells came to visit Jake in the medical bay and was introduced to Zara as a friend from Jake's past, who had found him at the station. Sam was curious about how Jake had met such an accomplished alien scientist, and Jake told him the story of the rescue mission on Silvana and how he had carried Zara to safety during the evacuation. Sam said he was impressed that Jake had made such a lasting impact on someone's life, and that it was amazing how one moment of courage could create connections that lasted for years. As the evening progressed, Jake began to understand that his reunion with Zara was not just a coincidence, but Jake Miller was released from the medical bay 3 days later with instructions to avoid heavy lifting and combat duty for another week, while his plasma burns finished healing, but he felt better than he had in months, because spending time with Zara had reminded him why he had become a soldier in the first place and had given him a new perspective on the meaning of his military service. Zara had visited him every day during his recovery, and their conversations had covered everything from galactic politics to childhood memories to their hopes for the future. Zara showed Jake around New Terra Station and introduced him to her research. Colleagues who were impressed to meet the legendary soldier whose rescue of Silvani refugees had become a famous story in diplomatic circles as an example of human courage and compassion. Jake was embarrassed by the attention, because he still thought of the Silvana mission as just one day of routine duty. But Zara explained that his actions had inspired other humans to volunteer for refugee assistance programs, and had helped convince several alien species that humans could be trusted as allies and protectors. Council Representative Maria Santos invited Jake and Zara to attend a diplomatic reception, where representatives from dozens of species gathered to discuss trade agreements and mutual defense treaties, and Jake was amazed to see how easily Zara moved between different groups and helped translate not just languages, but cultural concepts that allowed beings from completely different backgrounds to understand each other. Zara introduced Jake to Ambassador Lyran, who was one of the few surviving Silvani elders, and who thanked Jake personally for his role in saving their people during the darkest period of their history. Ambassador Lyran told Jake that the Silvani people had established a new colony world called New Silvana, where they were rebuilding their civilization with help from human technology, and that they had named their capital city Miller in honor of the human sergeant who had risked his life to save Silvani refugees. Jake was deeply moved by this gesture and said he was honored that his name would be associated with the rebirth of such a peaceful and beautiful culture. But Ambassador Lyran said the honor belonged to Jake because without his courage, there would have been no survivors to rebuild anything. During their walks around the station, Jake learned that Zara had developed new translation software that could analyze the emotional content of speech in different languages and help prevent misunderstandings that often led to conflicts between species who meant well but could not communicate effectively. The software was being tested by diplomatic teams throughout human space, and early results showed that it could reduce negotiation time by 50%, while also increasing the success rate of peaceful agreements between former enemies. Zara took Jake to her laboratory and showed him the communication devices she was working on that would allow real-time translation between any two species, even if they had never encountered each other before. Jake watched in fascination as Zara demonstrated how the devices could analyze vocal patterns and body language and emotional indicators to provide accurate translations that preserved not just the meaning of words, but also the intentions and feelings behind them. Jake told Zara that her inventions could revolutionize diplomacy and prevent countless wars that started because different species could not understand what each other really meant when they tried to communicate. Zara said that all of her work was inspired by her experience of being saved by someone who did not speak her language, but who communicated kindness and protection through his actions and his expressions, and that she wanted to give other beings the same chance to connect across species barriers. Lieutenant Colonel Beth Adams arrived at New Terra Station to check on her injured team members and was surprised to learn that Jake had reconnected with someone from his past who had become an important scientist and diplomat. Jake introduced his commanding officer to Zara and explained how they had first met during the Silvana rescue mission 7 years before, and Beth said she was impressed that Jake's actions had such long-lasting positive effects beyond just the immediate military objectives. Beth told Jake that Shadow Squadron had received new orders to investigate reports of a slave-trading network that was operating in systems near the border with hostile alien territory, and that the mission would require infiltrating criminal organizations that were known for killing anyone who interfered with their operations. Jake said he was ready to return to active duty, but Beth noticed that he seemed less eager than usual to leave on a dangerous assignment, and she wondered if his reunion with Zara had given him new reasons to value his own safety. Zara knew that. Jake would have to leave New Terra Station eventually because military duty required soldiers to go wherever they were needed, but she hoped they would have more time together before his orders separated them again. She had grown to care for Jake as more than just the soldier who had saved her life because their conversations had shown her that he was intelligent and compassionate and dedicated to making the galaxy a better place for everyone who lived in it. Jake found himself reluctant to leave the station, not just because he enjoyed spending time with Zara, but because he had begun to see possibilities for his future that did not involve constantly risking his life in combat situations. Watching. Zara's work had shown him that there were other ways to protect people and prevent suffering besides carrying weapons and fighting battles, and he wondered if his military experience might be valuable in diplomatic or humanitarian roles. Dr. Foster visited Jake and Zara in the station's recreation area and told them how happy she was to see that they had found each other again after so many years of separation. She said that their reunion had given her hope that the galaxy was not as random and meaningless as it sometimes appeared, and that connections between people could survive incredible distances and hardships if they were based on genuine care and mutual respect. Zara asked Dr. Foster about opportunities for humans with military backgrounds to work in civilian roles that involved protecting people through diplomacy and humanitarian aid rather than through combat operations. Dr. Foster said that many organizations were looking for people who understood both military tactics and the needs of refugee populations, and that Jake's combination of field experience and natural compassion would make him valuable in several different career paths. Jake realized that Zara was trying to help him find alternatives to his current military assignment, and he appreciated her concern for his safety, but he also felt obligated to complete his service commitment and support his team members who depended on him during dangerous missions. Zara said she understood his sense of duty, but that she hoped he would consider what kind of life he wanted to build for himself once his military obligations were fulfilled. Ambassador Lyran approached Jake and Zara during a formal dinner and offered Jake a position as security coordinator for the new Sylvana colony world, where his military experience would be valuable in training civilian defense forces while also allowing him to work on peaceful projects instead of constant combat missions. Jake was intrigued by the offer but said he needed time to think about such a major career change and to discuss it with his commanding officers. Zara felt her heart racing when she heard Ambassador Lyran's offer because it would mean Jake could leave military service and work on something meaningful while also staying close enough to New Terra Station that they could continue to see each other regularly. She tried not to show how much the possibility meant to her because she did not want to pressure Jake into making a decision based on her feelings rather than his own desires for his future. Jake spent several days thinking about Ambassador Lyran's offer and talking with his team members about the possibility of leaving Shadow Squadron for civilian work. Sergeant Ben Torres told Jake that he had served with honor for many years and had earned the right to choose a safer path if that was what he wanted, and that no one would think less of him for deciding that he had done enough dangerous missions for one lifetime. Lieutenant Colonel Beth Adams was understanding when Jake explained his interest in the new Sylvana position, and she said that the military always lost good people to civilian opportunities, but that Jake had already contributed more than most soldiers ever did and deserved a chance to build a peaceful life if that was what he wanted. She also said that having someone with Jake's background working with alien allies would be valuable for maintaining good relationships between human forces and non-human populations. Zara was working in her laboratory when Jake found her and told her that he had decided to accept Ambassador Lyran's offer and leave military service to help establish security systems for the new Sylvana colony. Zara felt joy flooding through her as she realized that Jake would be safe from the dangers of combat missions and that they would be able to continue building their renewed friendship without the constant worry that he might be killed during his next assignment. Jake said that his decision was not just about spending more time with Zara, although he admitted that was an important factor, but also about finding new ways to use his skills and experience to help people without having to kill anyone or risk being killed himself. He said that meeting Zara again had reminded him that saving one life could have effects.